Thank you, Michael. And one thing I wanted to point out early on is this should be interactive, right? So there's a lot of good experience here. So anytime we can bring things up, if we need to, we can share the mic around or whatever. And I want to talk about being agile about architecture based upon some experiences and some work I've done with a lot of colleagues. And so one of my complaints, I've been involved with Agile for a long time. In fact, I was doing XP in the 90s, actually, before there was the Agile Manifesto. And I was at Smalltalk at that time and looking at doing good architecture, even for the Illinois Department of Public Health, which for an Illinois state government doing XP was quite a change, you know. Here, we're going to remove all the cubicles and set up this nice open space so we can do a lot of sharing, write a lot of unit tests, and do pair programming and do some of these Agile practices, but trying to meet, we were in the medical domain, so highly regulated and still meeting a lot of requirements with that and doing that. And so I've had a lot of experience in that, but a lot of times if you go to the Agile conferences today, it seems like there's kind of this tension between Agile and people don't talk much about architecture or oh, just let the architecture magically emerge or whatever. And I collaborated with evolving some of these ideas with my good friend from Brazil, Eduardo Guerra. So definitely want to put a shout out. So some of the he's a really good artist too. He actually makes board games a lot as well. He's very obsessed with that too. So some of the art stuff I used, I got from my good friend Eduardo in there with that. So I at least want to talk, at least have you know how I think about Agile to start off with. When I talk about Agile versus a tension with architecture and how there shouldn't be tension and how things can work together and do, if we allow it. And there's so many views on Agile. What is Agile? Oh, you're not being Agile because you're not doing your daily stand-ups like this, or you're not doing Scrum with your 2-week sprints, or, things like that. Let me just get a kind of a pulse from the audience to know who's here is using Scrum, for example. A lot of people. How about Kanban? Scrumban? Scrum butt? some other lean practices? Okay, such as?
Hodgepodge of mixed bag.
Hodgepodge, maybe mob programming or? Yeah. XP, okay. Scaled, okay. So you might be using the SAFe or other types of, okay. And so the main thing, and Agile obviously is pretty accepted. I mean, even a lot of around the world, even there's still some organizations that are, hesitant to completely embrace all of Agile, and even in certain cultures or countries, I travel around a lot and do a lot of consulting in different places. There's different kinds of acceptance with some of that, but a lot of people have this different view of what is Agile and how we should go with that. I mean, the main idea is we want to produce something of value for our business, keep going through and getting that, inspect and adapt and improve, learn from what we're doing and evolving, and ultimately keep an eye on how things are going. A lot of times people are looking at, well, you should do these kind of so-called Agile processes, even though when you look at the Agile Manifesto, they never really said this specific process is the Agile process. I know a lot of people doing Scrum who I would consider not very agile because they're stuck. They're not really taking advantage of some of the mindset things of that. So there's a lot of myths with Agile. For example, simple solutions always work well. Well, it depends on what you're working on. In the same way, when you easily adapt and change to new requirements, early on we get caught up with this, we're going at a fast pace because we're starting off with a clean sheet. And I'm working with the PO and I'm going through a few sprints and they're like, we have this new requirement, and they're asking how long I think it'll take. And they remember early on doing something kind of like that. And it only took maybe, a few days or a few weeks. And now I'm saying, now the system's got a lot more, we've released it. There's important qualities. We have to worry about security and scalability. This new feature is going to take 2 or 3 times as long. And so all of a sudden there's these issues. And also there's this myth that, if I just blindly follow one of these good, well-known practices, TDD with a lot of unit tests or Scrum or whatever, the architecture will magically emerge. we'll end up with good architecture if we just keep the code clean and keep refactoring as we go. And we can make significant changes at any point. And this is definitely one that you got to be very careful about, and this is where thinking about Agile and architecture is important. So I was working with one financial domain thing. We were more in the research environment for a very large company that was sponsoring some research I was doing, but we were very successful, so now they wanted to move it into production. Well, all of a sudden, this is financial. Security became an issue. Well, when we were developing from a research kind of mindset. So then we had to refactor and put security in, and that had a huge effect on changing, adapting the system. So even though we were able to make those significant changes, we weren't able to make it quickly, and had we known some of that, you could have architect or designed for these types of certain qualities. So it's important to think about that. So when I look at Agile, I really like the way my friend Linda Rising kind of looks at it. So when I think of Agile, I think of being Agile, don't do Agile. So when I'm doing something, it's like there's a single truth or rules and procedures, one way to do things. But when I'm looking at being, there's multiple truths, or it's like it depends. And there are different ways of looking at things. And you can balance a little bit of slow thinking and fast thinking. So on one hand, it's okay to go fast at times, and sometimes that fast thinking is the right way. It could save my life. I'm crossing the street, and a car's coming at me, and I jump out of the way. But sometimes I need to contemplate what route should I take to the airport. And same way with as we're developing our systems, are we developing the right thing? Am I adding value? Am I even building the right thing? So just blindly going fast might micro-optimize, but sometimes we need to step back, and are we moving in the right direction? So when I look at Agile, we have these different ideas or things we're working on. We're building and we're learning from that. And this even relates to the talk today. It was a very nice talk today. It's hard to value what you can't measure or what you can't see. How can I improve? So it's important to measure and learn from that, take the data, and inspect in that and really evolve that as we go. And a lot of times this part, people are really good at going really fast with this part of Agile. But it seems like a lot of times this part gets missed. And so this part is very key, and especially as we're designing and evolving the systems, learning what's going on and measuring, how much technical debt, what's going on with the system, what types of important qualities do we need to consider, and when should we consider them? When should we put them on the roadmap? So I claim values drive practice. By the way, that's Mary Lynn Mann's, I don't know if any of you know Fearless Change Patterns, but she did with Linda Rising. And so I like dancing, but if you're going to dance and be good dancing, if you value it, you got to practice, right? That's my good friend Richard Gabriel. He plays guitar. He's also a poet. He writes a poem a day, regardless. And he's been doing that for over 20 years. And he'll tell you he writes a lot of bad poems as well. But that's part of, if you value it, which he does, you practice it, and practice makes you better at it. So if values drive our practices, we need to think about what we value and what's important to our organization, and then it can drive our Agile practices as we think. So with Agile Lean, obviously there were these core values that a lot of people talk about: design simplicity, trust, openness, communication. But there's also this continuous improvement. Let's be learning, and building quality software. It's kind of hidden in there, but let's make it very explicit. We want quality software, and keep learning, and lots of testing is definitely a good thing. That I believe one of my favorite things that came from the Agile movement was the acceptance of we're going to have a lot of good quality testing back from the late 90s to early 2000s. So there's a lot of these good principles and practices from Agile. There's no silver bullets, but the main thing when I look at Agile, I look at having good people, giving them what they need, continuous learning and stuff. And it's not like if I'm doing Scrum today the same way I was doing it a year ago, then I claim I'm doing it. I'm not being very agile. I haven't learned. So, and also depending on who I'm working with, we might adapt the process just a little bit. First I learn it by the book, then I have to incorporate it into what works for me and you and my team, and then ultimately we might need to kind of move above and beyond it. Now, nowadays, things are becoming much more challenging. So when we think about Agile and architecture's always been a challenge. But the challenge is growing a lot. I mean, now we have, well, what should we do? How are we doing? Machine learning, big data? Do we have some data science going? Should we put things out on the cloud or not? And and we're trying to really balance. On one hand, we want to have a sustainable architecture and meet important qualities, but we want to start and move fast and be lean and nimble and be able to adjust to the market and things that we learn. So how do we balance that so we don't, I use the term over-architect the system, or build in stuff that we don't need. How do we kind of balance that and fit into from the Agile mindset? So I'm going to actually before we get started here, I put some pieces of paper on. I want to take at least 1 or 2 minutes because I want to use this for later on. What I'm going to do is present some patterns. I want you guys to write down a problem or two that you're having with architecture or challenges that you're having in your job today. And then after I present the patterns, we can kind of get together shortly, for about 10 or 15 minutes in groups and then just kind of share some ideas of how these patterns could potentially have worked or maybe not worked, and maybe there's some other ideas we can use with that. So I don't want this just to be me talking for 90 minutes, which I could easily do. I think it's better if I'll present some of the patterns that we've written down and I'll make available to you they're available online, best practices or some good proven practices that we've seen. But it's also good if you kind of look at them and think about them and challenge them from that. Okay? So just take 1 minute, everybody, if you could write down 1 or 2 challenges or problems that you've had with architecture. We'll just share 1 or 2 of the problems just to help. Did anybody have one they'd like to share? Who could share one? Okay. Just briefly share 1 or 2, and then we'll move on.
I have one problem that I have been dealing with for the last 10 years at least. It's about how you would have an interface without having to change the interface to the backend, the databases,
okay,
without having to change the schema of the databases.
Okay. Yeah, whatever. And the challenges can be from technical to the Agile side or to whatever, architecture, whatever. Okay. One other one.
One is that the ideas we're thinking about in architecture are invisible and in many ways perfect. And when you get down into the code, you can't see them directly, and that they may be imperfectly revealed in the code.
So how can you make them visible or whatever type? Okay, good. Okay, very good. So anyway, we'll come back to some of that. That was just to break things up a little bit and get you thinking. I'm going to use patterns here. I've written, the patterns that I'm going to present to you have been written up and published, and it's based upon some industry experience that we have in working with a lot of different colleagues, but these are my two co-authors, Rebecca Wurzbach and Eduardo Guerra. And I want to at least tell you what patterns are. I've been involved with the patterns community. I evolved from the software architect group in the early 90s with the Gang of Four guy, the design patterns, Ralph Johnson. We were doing, I've been writing patterns since the 90s. I'm also a board member for the Hillside group, which we sponsor pattern conferences around the world. And the idea behind it was really, let's try to document and share. It's almost anti-patent. Let's share knowledge about good proven practices that work. We used to say best practices, but I don't want to say, it's hard to prove best. But these are obviously proven good practices because people are using them. And like with the Gang of Four, they would show many examples of where these design patterns, and it's proven the test of time. After 20-some years, you can do an object-oriented design for reusable systems. You see that. And so in the patterns community, a lot of times we say proven solutions to repeating problems. Though sometimes, that's because a lot of us being software engineers, we like to do problem solving. But people designing user interfaces that's written patterns or other types of things, sometimes they're not looking at solving problems, they're designing something new. So it's proven practices to repeating situations. So when they're designing something new, they have some good practices they do over and over again that works. And so it captures a lot of knowledge of experts, and it embodies quality attributes for specific designs. Now there's been a lot of, in fact, Mary Shaw, Garland and Shaw came to our early PLOP conferences, pattern languages of programs, and they published a lot of the architectural patterns. And then obviously you know about some of those books. And then you have the POSA, the Patterns of Software Architecture book as well that went out there. So patterns, so we're going to go through some of these patterns. And these are Agile architecture patterns that we put together. based upon some experience, embodying that experience. So there's two sets of patterns that you're going to see. One is I'm going to talk about before your first iteration. I'm going to show you first. Even though these patterns can be done at any time, but if you're starting something new, these are good things to kind of think about before you start as well, and it can help guide you as you're starting a new project. And other patterns is as you're going through your project. But at any time, you could come back to these because it could be that you're in the middle of a project and you need to rethink about where we're going to go. So when we're getting started, you know, we need to really think about different previous things that we've been working on, previous projects or patterns. And we talk about climbing on the shoulders of giants. And so you might have different types of patterns of solutions we've used, certain reference architectures that we might look at. You know, are we going to be doing cloud, or are we using microservices architecture style, or you know, SOA, or are we going to be using .NET or Java, or so? And we need to kind of look at these different types of things. Now, some decisions you need to make early on, but we want to look and kind of make these big guiding kind of decisions of where we're going. Or it could be you're in the middle of a project too, and you've been doing the monolith architecture, but now we want to move towards microservices to get some of the benefits of that. Are there some different types of things that we need to look at? You know, are we going to Dockerize things? You know, we're going to use Kubernetes, or what, you know, what technologies are we going to use? Are there some different frameworks we need to think about with that? And so basically, in general, we try to build on some kind of reference architecture, and having a good reference architecture has been around for a long time. And here's kind of an example. By the way, I'm not an Azure, Microsoft Azure. I'm not promoting anything there. I'm just using this as an example, okay? In fact, I've never built any IoT stuff with Azure. But this is an example, is maybe we're deciding we're going to build an IoT thing, and we want to use the Azure reference architecture that they have out there, you know, and they kind of provide this reference architecture, but we're going to build in for our IoT edge devices, going through the cloud kind of things that they have. We may have to do some data transformation for putting things over, going into our database and things like that, but we can think from an architecture, what are we going to build on, and does it support and meet kind of our long-term vision and goals of what we need for this project. Now, once we've started the architecture, we can move through. We're climbing on the shoulders of giants, and at this thing, we need to look at where it hurts. And by where it hurts, if we're in existing projects, we may have some pain points, some areas, maybe certain qualities are giving us a problem we need to scale up, or we have a vision and we know that we're going to have these important types of things coming up. So knowing what are the different pain points, what are the things that causes problems. It could be things where the reference architecture doesn't work so well, or we have to extend it. Maybe security is a main issue, and we have to think of, well, what kind of security access? You know, do we need role-based access? Do we need other types of things that we need to build in specific? Do we need to worry about, some scalability or other types of issues? And so by having this and thinking about these issues, it can kind of help guide us when we're making our decisions. And so after we do, when we're looking at what pieces can we build upon, what are we going to go, what are the issues that we really need to be concerned about, we need to plan for responsible moments. So we don't want to overplan, but we need to think about, we can put on our roadmap when and where we should consider these things. So when we're planning for responsible moments, you know, we're building on our reference, when should we think about security? We know security is an issue. Do we have to solve it right away? Maybe. But maybe we need to kind of get maybe we need to go out and build kind of a little piece up and get enough infrastructure up where now we need to build the security in at this point, because now we've got more there that we can deal with that. Same way with performance. It could be that we need to look early on because we know we're going to scale up, or we're going to have potentially millions of customers. So maybe we need to look at it earlier. So what we want to do in our roadmap is put things, important architectural decisions, on our roadmap. When we should consider them. And sometimes it might be considering a few options and learning from it and adjusting our roadmap based upon what we learn from that. Now this is where a lot of people in Agile really miss the point. Because you have this misnomers a lot of times in Agile where people say, wait till the last responsible moment. Now that sounds good, last responsible moment. Unfortunately, people misinterpret that to be the last possible moment. And so I can still do it, but it can cause a lot of pain and refactoring and tearing up the systems and a lot of muddiness and other problems. When there might have been a more responsible moment, if we had looked at security or other issues, maybe after 3 or 4 sprints rather than after 10 sprints, it would have been built into the architecture much better, and it wouldn't have tore things up as much, and it would have been a better time to look at that. So when we're looking at that's why we've coined the term choose the most responsible moment rather than the last responsible moment, because there might have been a more responsible moment when you could have done that. And so it's important to qualify our roadmap with these architectural decisions. And when should we put things on the roadmap? Now, because of NDAs and stuff like that, I can't put real roadmaps out here, right? With clients I've worked with. But here you can have kind of an example of, maybe we're going to move into some microservices and we're going to go out to the web and work with the Android piece. Here's where we want to start looking at the microservices part, and there might be some security issues that we need to look at across the microservices. And so we can really strategize on our roadmap when we should think about this. And so that fits into the Agile mindset, but we're including as part of that roadmap not just features for the customers, important architectural decisions and important architectural qualities. Now, it's not like we're stuck to this roadmap. We're being Agile, so as we learn things, we're adjusting this roadmap with things that we learn. And sometimes that could be where you're trying to couple things and then you decide this works better than that, or between these two, it gives you some kind of new alternative to go forward with. Okay? So far we've been climbing on the shoulders. We start off by climbing on the shoulders of giants, finding out where it hurts, and to be prepared for the most critical issues. If these are very important to the organization, when should we consider them? These are important architectural decisions or quality attributes. And to focus on relevant issues and to define the architecture, we might need to experiment, does this work or not? And we call that tracer bullets. And so basically, when you're looking at things here with the tracer bullets, which also can guide the choice for your responsible moments, we might need to learn a little bit. So we might need to do a little bit of some spike type things to learn from that. Is we might need to, probably some people can recognize some Angry Bird kind of whatever. But you can think about, so here we're building on this reference architecture. We have these important qualities and attributes we need to think about. And maybe we need to do some experiments to make sure it's going to, this is going to work, and where should we think about this based upon our architectural requirements with that. And so we call that using tracer bullets, which can kind of tie into some different spike solutions. Spike solutions are similar, but they focus on a certain part of the solution, whereas this might try to do a full path. Maybe we're taking the reference architecture and making sure the reference architecture is going to be good enough to meet a lot of our quality requirements by trying to build some kind of sample to see if it's good enough with that. And then from there, to define tests, and this is why I appreciated there was actually a nice talk yesterday, which will be made available by Brian, that was at USAA stuff, talking about test architecture. So if we want to make sure that things are testable, it's good to kind of build that in and think about that. Is make it more testable. There might be some frameworks you can already use, but there might be some design decisions and architectural decisions as you're evolving your system that you can build in to make the system more easy to test. And if you design it to make it more testable, it makes it easier to automate and build that in as you go. A lot of times if we just go on and build a system, now we're going to test it, it can be very hard to test and especially automate because of the way that the system is built and validated. So, but we can build this as part of some of our core pieces with that. And, actually that can be even used to help validate some of the tracer bullets on that. And so testing is key. So if there's certain types of things that we know that are important, how can we build that in and make that part of our architecture so that we can validate and get that type of data and hopefully automate this as much as possible with that. So note, so this is really, before you really start the project, before we get running with the project, we're going to be climbing on the shoulders of giants, noticing if there's certain important things that we need to put on our roadmap. When do we plan for that? Sometimes we might have to use some tracer bullets to help guide our decisions on that. We want to really be able to think about how we want to validate the system and test it, which we can also climb on the shoulders of giants to do that. There might be already some frameworks or other things that we can use, but we might build some extra things or include certain practices we want teams to use to help with that. And so this can help us guide as we're starting. So this is our first set of patterns. And we've written these all up independent, and I'll make available all that information. Now, during the project, and notice those others you can still be doing, you can do it any time during the project, because you might all of a sudden need to make a new change. Maybe there's new business requirements, or now all of a sudden our company's going into some kind of new direction and we have to adjust the system to that. So we can go back and do some reevaluation and readjust our roadmap based upon that. But during the project, I want to cover another set of patterns that we can go over. But before I do, let me ask, are there any kind of questions or discussions anybody wants to make about any of this? Is this clear? Clear as mud? Hopefully not big balls of mud, right? Okay? Does that make sense? By the way, if there's any others that you think of, since that's what patterns are about, sharing knowledge, and we're always welcome to that type of feedback with that. Okay. So let's look at during the project. So anyway, now we have, I'm assuming at some point we've planned for our responsible moments. There's some kind of roadmap. We've worked with product owners, the different stakeholders. I believe that it's very important as Agile architect that if you have an architect within your organization, or even if you don't, key technical people and quality people should be working closely with the PO for planning this roadmap as we're going through. So as we're going through with this, it's important to think about when we should put things in the backlog and how we should prioritize them. And a lot of times, if you're just blindly with the PO view from that, this never gets put in the backlog, even though it needs to be done. Which means sometimes it doesn't get the value and the effort that it needs. But it is important to add this. So a lot of organizations have learned this the hard way. And so if you have a PO that comes from more of a technical background, a lot of times they're more open to these, having this type of ideas. But other times it has to work with a collaboration where we're on the same team working together. And it shouldn't be an us and them. That's part of the Agile mindset. We're all trying to do this together. And we can include some of these different types of things, like maybe there's certain kind of cross-cutting things, like security, or if we're looking at performance, that might cross a lot of user stories. And there's a lot of ways of putting these quality attributes and adding them to user stories. Sometimes you may have a user story that's very specific, that just to the certain architectural or the specific quality attributes you want to look at. Here we might even put some eliminate technical debt. Yeah, good luck with eliminating all technical debt, right? But we can definitely put technical debt in the backlog, and it could be, and especially if we do like what we saw this morning in the talk, is capturing the data, showing where technical debt is really hurting certain part of technical debt. And we have good data showing that, wow, we better value that these teams are having trouble. Look how long it takes them to release, and look at how many defects they have. And look, we can relate it back to how entangled this code is and some of the problems with that. And so if we have some of that data, we can make a good business case that during this sprint, we need a little bit of extra time to adjust with that. In fact, the payoff, it may take just as much effort or less effort to eliminate that technical debt and add those new features than just blindly trying to add that new features to a system that has a very muddied up system. So we can include architecture in the backlog, but in addition to that, it's also important to think about certain, to be monitoring stuff as you go, and especially things that we value highly, and things that we can only, and that's why I like that quote from this morning, we only value what we can measure, or I think what you can see. I can't improve it if I'm not watching what's going on. So we might have some architectural triggers, some things that we kind of need to watch out for, considerations that cause us to wait, during the next sprint, maybe we should do a little investigation. Okay, we're going along here. Performance is still okay, but wow, look at how it's moved this way over the past few months. It's not like it's a problem yet, but we can see that maybe we need to start creating at least a couple members of our team to do a little bit of a spike solution, or do a little bit of a check, because the quality target is starting to move away from what we're going to get. And so rather than wait until the fire happens, and so then we're frantic trying to put out a fire, maybe we can adjust and start looking at this ahead of time by focusing on, by having these triggers. But if we're not measuring and watching, we're not going to know that this is happening until it's too late. All of a sudden, all our customers are calling and complaining, and the system went down, or we had people were up all night trying to fix this system. All the help, people were called in, and so having these different architectural triggers are, if there's certain important quality attributes, let's find a way to monitor and measure and make that visible to the team. And so even as we're coming along, one of the things I was impressed when I went to Spotify a few years ago, and I went there with Woody Zoll, and they were looking at some mob programming things, but I was also looking at the way the teams were working together, and they have a very nice atmosphere how the Agile teams work together at Spotify, and this was in Sweden at the time I was there a few years ago. And they had so much visibility of other types of things going on within the system. So it could be that all of a sudden I'm even seeing people possibly tweet about issues going on with that, or other types of performance, not like information overload, but things that added value, that the team saw values in. And sometimes that included some important architectural qualities, and it could be that I'm working on that part of the system, and having that visible to me, it's like, wow, I'm getting ready to release, and I kind of know that, and as I'm adding this feature, it can really help influence me to make sure I'm considering these types of things. So making this visible is very valuable for the team, and it's a good practice for what are the important architectural qualities that we should work on with that. Usually when we're looking at these architectural triggers, we're looking at things that have more like a broad system impact. Now this can relate to your normal qualities such as performance, reliability, but it might be things like technical debt as well. How long is it taking to, time between commits? How many things have to change together, and what's going on in the code? How big things are getting? How big are the functions getting versus the complexity, and et cetera. So from here, and even as you're planning for responsible moments, or as you're putting architecture in the backlog, you might occasionally need to do certain experiments with part of the system and do a spike. Now these aren't like the XP spike solutions, but you might think where I need to investigate something that came up and we need to go and try and compare and make decisions on. Wow, we're really reaching the limits of our large Oracle database that we're getting, and it's growing many terabytes of data, and we can see that we're on an exponential path. I have one organization I'm working with that's dealing with this right now. And how much are we going to be able to keep just buying much more hardware to kind of grow like this? Maybe we need to investigate, are there some other ways, experiment and try some different spikes. How can we manage? We're okay for the next 6 months to a year, but we know if we don't start thinking about this now and kind of evolving our architecture with this, we're going to have quite an effect with that. So based upon that, maybe we should do a little bit of spikes. Let's get together a little mini team or a couple people or maybe just one person. And it could be a whole sprint spent on this, but it could be maybe just a day or whatever. It depends on how big the task is that you need to look at with what you're doing. but you're trying to do this architectural stuff. So maybe we need, based upon new functionality, we want to try new technology that we're not using now. But the main thing with this is you want to have being in the Agile mindset with Agile architecture, is to limit the amount of time, you time box it, get the data, come back and reassess, rather than just go off or, well, I'm still looking at it. A month later, I'm still looking at it. No, you want a time, okay, maybe you say a sprint, maybe it's 1 week, 2 weeks, maybe you say 2 days, maybe you say a half a day. Let's make a decision on this spike, spend this much time, go learn something, and let's come back and talk about it. And then we can reassess, should we go spend more time on it? Maybe you decide that, or maybe you try something else. Or maybe you hire an expert, or whatever you need to do. It really kind of gives us more information so we can learn and make better architectural decisions as we go. And so really when we're doing this, we're trying to answer deep questions. So these aren't as tactical usually as like an XP design spike. And they're very visible, but they can be a whole sprint depending on how big they need to get. Okay? And then from there, we should still be dealing with technical debt. Technical debt comes up where anytime like I have a friend that's a master chef cooking in a kitchen. As he's cooking, it's always fun whenever I got invited over to his house to eat because I knew I was getting a good meal, right? But one of the things is watching him in action. Obviously, he's dirtying up some of the dishes as he's cooking, but he has a process to keep his kitchen somewhat organized and clean as he goes. Same way with our system and our architecture. We know as we're evolving and meeting business requirements, sometimes we may even make a tactical business decision to incur a little bit of technical debt. But if we're not paying attention and we're not managing it properly and prioritizing it, and technical debt obviously we've talked about a lot, and they even have a conference I believe that's coming up next month in Montreal as part of with ICSI for technical debt management. It's also with the XP conference will be up there. But some technical debt can be very hard to clean. This was a term coined by Ward Cunningham back in the early 90s. And really, this technical debt piles up if you're implementing and things you learn, if you don't go back and apply those things you learn back into the architecture and into the system. Now, sometimes there's intentional short-term or long-term strategic proactive, but if it's unintentional, maybe we have unexperienced people or sloppy work, or we're just not doing the best practices. But ultimately, the problem happens if it goes too long and unconstrained, then it can have long-term disastrous effects, or definitely hurt us from. In fact, it can make it so we're not as lean and agile because the system's too hard to change. And there could even be things I even call like architectural debt, quality debt, test debt, because we haven't spend enough time in paying attention to some of these other things. Maybe we've put off certain, doing enough testing and we don't have enough coverage in certain types of important qualities that we need to. And so maybe we need to put a little bit of effort into including that. So managing technical debt is very important. And and it can be a lot of things. I'll put a shout out to a friend of mine from Brazil. She just finished her PhD, but this is based upon a lot of industry research, Grisella. And she was really looking from the business perspective of this, because not all technical debt should be paid. If this part of the system is working, yeah, it's a mess. I don't want to go brag to all my other technical friends with how good this looks, but it's working and it's not changing. And maybe we've even wrapped it up well enough, put a facade or, wrapper patterns around it. Why change it? Why rewrite it? But there could be other parts of the system that's having an impact, technical debt impact, and we have to make business decisions. But here's where we have to be able to see it, just like what we heard this morning. You can't fix what you can't see. Let's make it visible and be able to address these types of things. In some qualities, we all know about these qualities. These are obviously very important when we're looking at systems. But there's some qualities that sometimes are hidden in the system and don't get looked at as much, which can really affect our development velocity, such as maintainability, evolvability, testability, deployability. A few years ago, Chris Richardson here at SATURN gave a keynote, really talked about the importance of when we're looking at these qualities are an important factor for affecting our development velocity. So thinking about them and making business decisions on these But here is where we need good data. We can do data science or having some kind of way where we can make good business decisions. We don't, you know, I feel that if we change this class this way, or if I change the architecture with these types of components this way, it'll make it more maintainable. I need data to back that up and make it visible. We can show how it can even affect our development velocity, which can keep us more lean with that. And in fact, I like to relate it to the business S-curve. We have a new idea and it takes off, and when we're maturing it, our practices need to evolve as you transition to different parts of the curve. We can think of, we're starting a new lean startup, we have brainstorming these ideas, and all of a sudden it goes viral. Well, we need to change our practices. Here, we were just experimenting. It wasn't technical debt yet. We're just trying things, we don't know. But if it takes off and matures, now we have to scale up, more architectural documents, and it can get to a maturity. Kent Beck kind of calls this his 3X model with what he does on that. So visibility is important. So I was real happy this morning that that was a big part of what the person was looking at, is having this data, and it can help make good decisions. But also with our, not only external for baseball, but also for our systems and how we're developing the architecture as we evolve. We need to, I can't fix and improve what I can't see. So, you know, I always look at it, well, maybe I need to lose weight. Yes, I do. So if I do, I better be monitoring, right? If I'm not monitoring what's happening, how many steps am I taking a day, or what's my calorie intake, and what's improved, I won't be able to see what's am I making the right progress with that. So to be aware of problems in the architecture, you can use something that me and Paulo Merson wrote up with another colleague a couple colleagues of ours, called continuous inspection. And so this detects problems in the code and in the architecture. You might have certain architectural things that you want to monitor. This is back to what George was talking about earlier. It can kind of help maybe make things more visible with the architecture. So it doesn't, maybe we need to make more, the people that are help guiding, the guild that's help guiding the architecture is putting certain inspection things, and it can even point out problems with the architecture. So maybe we want everybody to use this framework, but we find a lot of developers are trying to find ways to cheat around using that framework. You know, but this framework's supposed to help make sure we're secure and meet the regulations. Why aren't you? Well, maybe I'm a new guy and I don't know about the framework, so maybe you need education. But it could be the framework has a problem and we have to see a way of evolving and fixing that. That's why we have that. So it's not meant to be the architectural police, even though Mary Shaw was telling me that she's okay with having some rigorous more constraints on that. But it's really meant to kind of, so that we can learn and see what's going on. And so it can be a part of also this. So continuous inspection is really taking both the source code and running software, doing some analysis, giving feedback not only to developers, but to architects, QAs, possibly product owners or whoever. This is for, we're supposed to be visible and transparent. We're not, so let's try to share this knowledge as part of that Agile mindset. And how can we improve on this? And automation is key. Automate, 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 right? Is what I say. And I like that. This is a quote I really like from Bill Gates. Is the first rule is automation to an efficient operation will really magnify that efficiency, but it's also show magnify the inefficiency. So there's a lot of things that, you know, repetitive tasks, error prone, involves waiting, quality metrics, code smell things, architectural conformance. We can automate some of that and make that part. With continuous inspection, you actually have a way that you could actually be monitoring the code as it's evolving and even give feedback to the development team, or even kind of maybe you have a guidance team that's looking things over as how things are going with the architecture. So I presented now some patterns that we can do before you start the architecture, but not really anytime you can do these, right? Because you could be in the middle of the project and now we need to make some decision changes. So let's think about, is there new reference architectures, or how do we need to test it? Do we need to plan for responsible moments? And then we have, so here's kind of our complete set of patterns that we have. And then once we're going in the project, we include architecture in the backlog. Whenever we need to, there might be different triggers that include different events. Maybe we need to experiment with a spike. We're dealing with technical debt as we go, and we're keeping things visible so that we can help us guide decisions that might lead us back to making new architectural decisions and climbing on the shoulders of new giants as well with that. So what I would like to do So it's easy for me to just kind of like, okay, blah, 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 right here are these patterns. And I'll definitely make all the material that has a lot written about each one of them available for everybody. I'll give you a reference for that. But I would like to at least spend, do kind of a time check here. Oh, we have plenty of time, good. So I'd like to do at least 15 minutes of people working in like groups of 5 or so at each table, just to take one of your problems or whatever, and so have somebody within a group convince the other group of what that is. I always like to say groups about 4 to 6, somewhere in there seems to be the good number, 5 or 6 or 7. And brainstorm which set of these patterns maybe could help you deal with some of the problems that you're looking at. And also if there's anything missing, point that out as well, of course. And which patterns were more relevant or whatever from that. Does that make sense with that? And then I'll go around and I can be your product owner and or your, if you want technical advisor or whatever with the pattern, I'll be your pattern advisor. I'll leave these up for people to look at as we go with that. So people like that exercise kind of? So who would like to volunteer to, I'd like to get at least, we don't have time for every group to share. I wish if I was doing this normally as a half day, I'd even have more exercises with more interactive sharing, but we should at least get a couple groups to share a little bit about the problems, what patterns might have helped them or that they applied and how they were thinking about using that. Who would be a good volunteer group for that?
Okay, so part of our problems was, okay, I run down a combination of our problems. One is from an architecture's point of view, where our architecture team wears many hats, and so they don't have time to really put an exhaustive effort into all an overall architecture thing of the whole system. We're moving to Agile, so it needs to be fast-paced. The turnaround is too quick in most cases for us to keep up with our feature teams. And so how do we make sure that we plan, we do enough architecture and produce enough artifacts for our feature teams within the sprint? And so one of the patterns is that we identified is plan for the responsible moments. You know, look at the features, make sure that quality attributes of the immediate stuff is addressed for each iteration. And then we had the problem of, okay, we plan for these responsible moments now. We have this architectural tech debt backlog. What do we do? Why we don't have the authority in many cases to allow the architectural team to say, hey, we're gonna not do this feature from the product team in order to meet this technical debt. And so one of the things that these patterns identify is the architectural triggers that in many cases, if you have the stakeholders involved in the original architecture where we say we're going to take these strategic risks, then they should have the architectural team should have the authority that when those triggers appears, then the architectural team say, hey, well, we decided early on that we're going to take these strategic risks. These are the triggers are up now, so now you need to pay that debt. And so just having those in place and having all the stakeholders sign off that this is the way we're going to work to make sure our technical debt management gets looked at and everything works cohesively.
Oh, very nice. And I think we were even, at least at the end, you were even talking to me a little bit about some continuous inspection things that can help feed back into some of that technical debt management and those triggers. Very, very good. Let's give at least one other team. Who's another team that would like to volunteer and share the problem and some of the things that we're looking at with the patterns? Don't be too shy or fly.
Okay, so we have our problem or shared problem was that we are getting requirements very often. Like every new sprint, the client just comes in like, hey, I want this thing and I want that thing and I need it now and
featureitis, whatever.
Yeah. So the patterns that would that would work best with us is technical debt management, because we incur a lot on that, trying to push these features as fast as we can. Continuous inspection, because at some point, well, something's gonna go wrong with the stuff we're doing. And architectural trigger. Can you explain that?
Well, it's the same as in your case. So you make it transparent beforehand. You get into the responsibility together with the PO to say, hey, I'm taking this risk with you, but this is a trigger. And when the point comes, you say, hey, we took the risk. It was fine for me, but now's the point. Let's act.
Okay, very nice. Is there anybody else with a burning desire, or possibly they even had something that they felt that maybe a missing pattern or whatever, or something else they just really want to share? We have enough time. We could do one more. I'm definitely doing good on the schedule. Right here. One more. Okay. Awesome.
So it's not just architecture, I think it's organizational as well. When you
Okay.
say you find where it hurts, if you get to a point where you're not effectively being able to get architecture together, one of the things that happened in our company, we were having that happen, so we ended up forming a small team that's off the sprint cycle. That's why we do Kanban. But we help drive the architecture. So you have a core group of people that do that, because otherwise, if it's just scattered all over the place, there's not, you don't have any technical leadership. So I think to find where it hurts also can apply to your organizational structure.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and actually, when we wrote it up, we only focused on the one side, but that's something I should definitely talk to some of my colleagues about, adding another, because that can also affect some of the other things that you have to try to put in place or work on the roadmap, depending upon the organizational side. Or maybe we should use Kanban rather than Scrum or whatever, or we need some kind of to rethink that. That's very good.
The development teams do sprint cycles, just our architecture team. We're kind of like the middle part of the safe, where you have the system level and then you have
Okay.
the level.
Okay. That's very good. Thank you. That's very good. Yeah, and we have looked at the people side with some other stuff we've written out, but these patterns we didn't so much. But that's the process, or the people side is very core for that. So I mean, one of the ultimate, obviously one of the long-term goals is to have a sustainable architecture, but you still want to start and be able to evolve your architecture. And as part of the, for me, for Agile architecture is this, the continuous improvement of the architectural quality. And maybe sometimes we're starting, I was talking with one group back there, as one of their problems was dealing with a ball of mud already. So if you already have something like that and you got to evolve it, you can think of some of the different patterns, whether it's technical debt management or some small things you can do, or even like with the one organization I was working with, they had a monolith. It's a kind of a ball of mud, but then they made an architectural decision to go to microservices and use a strangler application. They would try to pull off pieces of that mud, but sometimes they'd have to rewrite it, slowly strangling out parts of that, and it can help them to stay agile and evolve from that. But it was based upon getting the feedback and including it as part of their planning and evolving that. So it's important as we're going through to think about how we want to test key components and their performance and as we're going through this. And we want to verify any of our architectural assumptions. So it's important to make things visible, benchmark early, then track, because otherwise we lose the visibility and it's hard to know what's going on. What's the push-pull response times, or what's happening with the system. And I definitely, it's hard for me to almost talk about anything about improving if I really don't think about including pause points. So Agile's really good, and a lot of times it seems like management's really good. How fast are we going? What's the velocity? What's our burn down rate? And they like looking at those numbers. But then sometimes that might give you, okay, I can show you that we're going real fast, but are we building value? Maybe we're going really fast with what we're doing now, but maybe there's a better way where we can achieve the same results with half the effort. But if we don't have pause points, times to think and improve, that will never happen. So we need slack time. I've written this up as a slack time pattern. We need slack time to improve and to ensure quality. If we're always putting out fires constantly and we never have time to address the technical debt and or even rethink, experiment, I even relate, Google used to have, I don't know, George can tell me, but Google used to have, back in the day, that 1 day a week thing. You remember that, George? I don't know if you were ever participated in that. I think even I heard Gmail came out of that and other good stuff came out of that, where 1 day a week, now that's quite a bit, but 20% of the time, people could, the team members could do with whatever they needed. Now, that's kind of an extreme type thing, but you need some kind of slack time. I don't think they do this quite so much anymore from what I've heard from some of my friends inside Google, but having some of that slack time where you're not going to innovate if you don't have time. So one way to get slack time is, well, I'm still back to this visibility, just like what we heard earlier today, and I hear over and over again, is we need to monitor and make visible what's going on. We might find some wasteful things going on. We can reduce that waste. But the problem happens is sometimes when people reduce waste, they find out, ooh, we're doing some repetitive tasks or we don't need to do this as much. So they save 10% off this. The tendency, we start feeling guilty if we're not doing something. So let's just shift all these tasks over, and that's how we'll take advantage of that 10%. Rather than using that 10% to maybe we find a much better way of doing things with that. So having a little bit of where we can try experiments and maybe even find an order of magnitude better way of doing the same thing. And so that's where if we get some slack time, maybe we need to inject it into the process. I knew one development team I was working with where every day they come in and they would do a daily stand-up and all that. But before they did the daily stand-up, they're still waiting for everybody to get there and having their coffee, is they would be looking at what happened, any technical debt that they had from the day before, doing a little bit of refactoring and cleanup. It's almost like doing my stretches before I do a run. And it can help me sustain my run in the long run. I can go much further. At the end of the day, they couldn't do that because they're putting out fires. Maybe they have to be thinking about family, going, meeting, whatever, or a lot of phone calls. We got to get this out now. But at the beginning of the day, and it's almost like getting the right mindset and helped influence them the whole day, almost like doing their daily stretches. So even injecting, that team did that on their own, injected a little bit of slack time into their morning process before the stand-up, and that way it even influenced what they would say at the stand-up. By the way, this famous person, much more famous than a lot of people I know, definitely than I am, Tom DeMarco, he talks about this a lot. He's got a good book on it. And the most important thing you'll learn from this book, Slack, getting past the burnout, busy work, and the myth of total efficiency. If you have a spring completely stretched to the limits, anything goes wrong, it's going to snap. But if you have a little bit of flexibility in it, then you can handle certain qualities come up or problems happen, somebody gets sick or whatever, you can adjust to that. And with that slack, you can also use that to help improve things. And this is also related to what I like to promote this book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a very famous book as well, but it talks about values in both. And so rather than always just go, 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 or red, green, if you're doing TDD, it's good to do refactor as well, a little bit of slow thinking, and maybe stepping back and talking to reevaluating with the architecture team or trying some little experiments with that. So Agile values can drive architectural practices. They shouldn't be considered, competing forces. They can actually work together. So Agile really says do something, but don't debate too long about it. We can get into we don't want to get caught up with analysis paralysis, but we do something that gives us information, improves your architectural ideas. And then, make it testable, get some feedback, and incrementally refine your architecture based upon this feedback, but think about where these qualities should be addressed, where on the roadmap. Some decisions we can put off for quite a long time, but some decisions we should think about early, and some of that might be to even try a few different spike type solution things and then help that guide our architectural decisions. So here, once again, are our patterns for evolving Agile architecture. Before a project, we were starting out where to start working with the architecture, climb on the shoulder of giants, find where it hurts, plan for responsible moments. You think about the way you want to test and use tracer bullets to kind of validate a way through the system as you're going. There's Eduardo and Rebecca, these papers can be found online, but you can also, so if you Google for it, or you'll be able to email me as well. And then patterns for evolving the Agile architecture during a project we talked about. As you're planning for responsible moments, you might think about architectural spikes and triggers, how we can put architecture in the backlog as we're going through the project, how we can manage some of our technical debt, use continuous inspection to help make things visible as we go with that. The continuous inspection, that's something I work with Paulo Merson and Eduardo and Ademar Aguilar. This might have code smell detections, but you might also have architectural conformance checks and application security checks. Some frameworks really help you automate this, and automation is key with this continuous inspection, because otherwise it has a tendency sometimes we're too busy. I'll look at it tomorrow, I'll do some of the inspection. But there's some things where they might be too hard to automate completely, so you may occasionally have to have some checklists and certain cadence, certain times during the rhythm of as you're going with your project where you do that. But what's nice is you can include, and actually Paulo's given a lot of talks here about this topic, and you can probably go and find online some recorded videos about continuous inspection. And in our paper we mentioned, depending on which languages you're using, for example, Java has a lot of open source tools that you can include in the IDE, and you have ways of defining not only your normal types of code check rules, but you can define new architectural type check rules that you could add in to your system that are certain qualities that you want to make sure that you're checking for as you go. Anybody that wants any more information, definitely I encourage you to dialogue with me, or I have both a good and bad problem today. The good thing is my friend Ademar is from Porto, and I'm flying there overnight tonight to see him tomorrow because I'm part of this Scrum plop. We're putting together a book that we're just finishing, and I need to be there by tomorrow. The sad thing is I have to leave here this afternoon, and generally I like to stay for the whole time of the conference in dialogue. So I'll be around for dialoguing a little bit right after this talk, but don't let that hesitate from getting a hold of you. I'll put the last slide up here real soon that gives you all my information from that. So anybody that wants to talk more about this or help with working on that, we even have some example codes depending on which language you're working with. Also, we worked with a lot of, this is what we got the New Innovations Award for a bunch of patterns for being agile at quality, which relates. So there are some ways of making things visible. We've written up a bunch of patterns on that. Obviously, I don't have time in this little mini workshop tutorial to go through these. But ways of identifying your qualities in an agile way, certain quality attributes, how can we tie them in, maybe either with quality stories or adding to existing stories, different qualities, and how to spread the quality out to your organization as you go. And so we have about 24 patterns there that we wrote up, and 6 papers we have on that. These are mostly available online, all these patterns, including the continuous inspection. But feel free to, once again, I'll say to email me if you want, based upon this. So just to end up, once again, I want to say and I'm tying it into even though Kent Beck's 3X model, but you can think of the normal business S-curve, is we really need to think what's going on. Here, this isn't, you might say technical debt written off. I would say it's not even really technical debt at that point as you're experimenting. We're trying something. It's not technical debt, but why should I be paying a lot of attention if we're experimenting with a new idea? Lots of heavyweight testing and documentation and everything, because we don't know. We might be throwing it away. And that's overkill. We don't want to use the same practices we're using up here. This could be risky, cost our business millions of dollars in a day or whatever if we get something wrong. So here we need to really validate closely. But if something takes off, then we need to think about that. So as we move up on this, we need more architecture, QA, testing, and documentation as part of this process. So when I think of Agile architecture, I like to say a balance between what we used to call like lots of design and lots of upfront planning. It's okay to have some planning, but it's a rough adaptive planning, right balance of design and architecture. We used to call this traditional or waterfall, but sometimes people call this Agile. Oh, don't even think about it. Let's just do whatever. And that's chaos. That's crazy too. You can still be agile with architecture with that. So just to finish, and I want to finish a few minutes early in case there are any more discussions or questions, or if we want to go to lunch early, I have to put a shout out to my good friend Mike Beadle. Have any of you here know who Mike Beadle is? A few of you? It's very tragic, sad that last year he got murdered in Chicago. You know, somebody robbed him or whatever. But he was actually, when you think of Agile, he was one of the original signatures on the Agile Manifesto. He was the second adopter of Scrum behind Jeff Sutherland. He wrote the first book on Scrum with Jeff Sutherland. He was one of the big pushers in the Agile community and movement in the late 90s and early 2000s, and in enterprise Agile and a lot of the frameworks and SAFe and other things that kind of came. This is a guy pushing it. One of the last quotes from Michael before the tragic thing happened to him last year, he has this quote which I want to read to you because I think it fits in well. Agile doesn't cure incompetence. You can coach teams to be more engaged and collaborative, but no Agile framework, method, or mindset can save you from blatant failure if your development team is incompetent in basic engineering practices. And so, technical excellence is a must. So Agile should never be, in fact, some of the technical decisions I made with this company down in Brazil, I have a really nice talk I did at Agile Brazil last year, microservices for agility. And you think, oh wait, technology and agility, how do they fit in? Well, our technical decisions do affect our agility. So technical excellence is a must, so thinking about this is important. So when we're thinking about technical things, balancing people skills with technical skills is key. We need to value both and balance that. So it's a journey. Follow through with deliberate practices. Think of things that are rigorous, but pay attention and keep things visible. You know, it's a journey. So, and hopefully we get more confidence and we're continuously learning. So, hopefully with this, I had to have a test, right? Testing is important. If true, then if people are applauding, then the presentation should be done. And by the way, this is a quote out of our Big Ball of Mud paper, which is what I'm best known for only because I published that a long time ago, talking about the problems with if you don't pay attention. If you think good architecture is expensive, try bad architecture, right? So anyway, thank you very much, and I hope you found value with that. We may still have a few minutes for questions or discussions, right? If you want.
Maybe 5 minutes.
Okay.
Since you've been around since the beginning on the Agile movement and so forth, many of the same people in the 90s were writing technical books about practices and patterns and so forth. And in later years, those were, relatively speaking, de-emphasized compared to processes, okay?
Right.
And so I think some people today get the wrong idea that those same thought leaders don't believe in that last statement you just said, which is the technical excellence is so important. Wondered if you could just sort of talk about what's going on there and maybe explain how that came to pass.
Yeah. By the way, George, thanks for the great question, because that's, or the point, it's a very valid point that you're making, is actually a lot of the very technical people and from the patterns community is where all the Agile people came from. When you look at that, you had Martin Fowler, Kent Beck, all those people that came from that community at the time. And they still believe that way today. You talk to Alistair Coburn, all those people, they'll still tell you that Linda Rising, any of those people that were part of the original signatures on the Agile Manifesto with that. And I think something that's happened is, as Agile became so popular, a lot of your vendors and other things started selling processes and tools, and buy my tools, do my process, and you'll be Agile. But that was never really the intent of the early Agile Manifesto. I was talking with Kent Beck last year at the XP conference. He was a keynote speaker in Porto last year for that. And Kent Beck says, that's one of his complaints, is a lot of people seem to really miss the point with that. They're caught up and still missing that technical, it was really supposed to build the bridge between business and technology. At the Agile conference, a lot of times they don't accept as much technical type talks like they used to in the early days, as you might remember 10 plus years ago with that. And in fact, they even broke off a technical kind of sub-conference for that. And to me, that's kind of like going against what it's supposed to be, building a bridge between technology and the business, not to have this separation. So that's still, so a lot of us, and that's why I've been a big push in pushing out the myths, and that's why I put together agilemyths.com. Maybe you can go there, and maybe you have some other agile myths you'd like to put out there. Is we need to kind of really challenge this. Is our technical, it was never against technology. It's just that we're not going to overthink things, trying to find that right balance and learn. And that fits into anything we want to improve. We try experiments. Good scientists and engineers are constantly experimenting and trying new things and improving on that. So most of those people that I talk to definitely feel the same way with this. But you're right, a lot of when you go to the big Agile conferences, sometimes you get caught up with, you know, just the process. And Agile did not say it was there's no so-called, this is an Agile process. I look at it as people do process. We all have a process. And so there's some processes we can use while we're being Agile, whether it's XP, Scrum, Kanban, whatever. But I should constantly be thinking and reevaluating what works best, and one size doesn't fit all. I've been in an organization where some teams are doing Scrum, some are doing Kanban, some are doing mob programming, because that worked really well for those types of that team with that. So anyway, hopefully that addressed that. Yes?
We have maybe time for one more.
Yes, I think one more if anybody else wants to. Right here. It'd be the last one, I guess, because of lunch.
Okay, so my company has have a little slack time, and so some developers have been doing like those projects, and that turns into features that we want. And so obviously those, when that slack time occurs, there's no architectural oversight to those projects. And if the company wants to adopt one of those projects to be in the application, what is your recommendation for getting that Slack project, which could be a lot of code already written without unit tests, without this architecture, into actual production? Should we just throw it away and start from scratch, or what is the balance?
And my typical, that's a very valid concern. And something, when I think about that, I generally say, especially since I'm a consultant out there and working in the industry, I wish I had it on my laptop like Paula Merson has, but I say it a lot, it depends. So sometimes you might step back and think, oh, we should have a team own this now. We need an ownership. Let's find a product owner for it. It's a cool idea. It took off, you know, and now we want this. But now it has to go live. So now we need to, we had the idea, we were on the bottom of that SCurve, but it took off. So now, and sometimes you have people that are really good at wanting to do that, but now they're not wanting to take owner. So then sometimes you have to have another group of people that do like to take that, and they like to scale up. They're really good at, that's their skill. So let them take over, and they're better at adding these other kind of qualities, and which they might look at it or work with, maybe you're the one that experimented and come up with it, and then I can work with you on evolving it, and then for a while until you get bored and want to go try a new experiment. But I'm taking ownership at that point, and then we can decide whether to rewrite it or do whatever. So a lot depends, but that's where they need to really kind of think about where it adds value, okay? Okay. So anyway, thank you once again. I hope you find value, and definitely feel free to keep in contact, or let me know if anything you might want with this. I definitely like sharing and meeting new people with this. So thank you very much, and nice meeting everybody.